Hello and welcome to this video. And in this video I'm going to be very cold. It's part 4 of my history of progressive rock in 60 albums, and we've got up to the 1980s. And like I say, it's very cold in here, so I've had to put my heater on, so you might be able to hear in the background a little sound, and I know people always ask what that is. I hope it's not going to get on your nerves a little bit, but I can't, I've had to put my heater on, so it'll switch off in a minute. So 1980s, this video is going to be called the 1980s prog in every shape and form, right? So I'm going against the general narrative of what happens in the history of progressive rock. I think on the previous video we looked at sort of this golden age of prog in the early 70s, and then actually before punk comes out there seems to be a little bit of a crisis in the prog world, where prog bands are sort of, you can see they're not too sure what they're doing. They start to reconvene themselves into these new forms, and by the end of the 70s we have some huge progressive rock sorry, my computer nearly fell on the floor. Some huge progressive rock bands, and they finished in 1979 with The Wall by Pink Floyd, selling millions and millions, and sort of really turned on its head the idea that prog bands didn't know what they were doing, and they'd all been, you know, put off by these punks that had come out and shown them they were dinosaurs. This is not the case. So we enter the 1980s with a whole host of different prog ideas. Like, as I've said, you know, Rush came out in 1976 with 2112, and they sort of fused heavy rock with prog. And in 1980 we see the emergence of the new wave of British heavy metal, and that's got prog all over it. I've also discussed the idea of the post-punk bands actually taking more from prog than the punk actually influenced on prog. So we see a sort of an expansion of punk into much more intellectual and musical forms, in the forms of new wave, but also electro. And then finally, you know, sort of the rise of the new romantic bands, which seem to be very influenced by prog. Although they're not prog, those tendencies are there. So we see the influence of prog on, you know, especially English pop music. We see the influence of prog also emerging directly in the 80s, and we're going to get into this. So prog, it's not just in one place now. It's not just Yes and Genesis albums and then, you know, Euro prog happening like in Europe. It's not like that. There's a lot to cover. So I thought, what album am I going to have to cover the 1980s? Well, I've decided to go for Permanent Waves. Permanent Waves by Rush is an album where here we have a prog band that have, in their own doing, under their own influences, drawn themselves in. Right, but they've drawn themselves in a way where they're still making an out-and-out prog album. You know, Permanent Waves in 1980 is a out-and-out prog album, but it's different to the album that went before, Hemispheres, and it's definitely different to the album before that, Farewell to Kings, which can be seen by that band in 1976 as a wave goodbye to these old progressive rock tendencies. You know, in the title of Farewell to Kings. This is happening in 76. Believe me, in Canada in 76, punk has not reached Rush. So these bands, I think, and I think I've made the argument in the previous video, that these bands are already moving towards a more accessible presentation of progressive rock, and that's what we have with Permanent Waves. Permanent Waves is an out-and-out prog album. It has epics on there. It has that instrumental virtuosity and really weird structuring and difficult rhythmical and time signature passages. It does all the things that we expect prog to do, but it's doing it in a new way. Permanent Waves comes out, and at that point is Rush's biggest selling album, selling 1 million copies, which is the same amount that Never Mind the Bollocks sold when the Sex Pistols brought that album out in 1977, right? These bands are not threatened by punk, and hopefully I don't have to explain that anymore, because it'll help moving forward to try and really get into what's actually happening in the world of progressive rock in the 1980s. The following year, 1981, they bring out Moving Pictures. That sells 5 million copies, right? So prog bands are still there, and they're still selling millions. There's still a commercial entity. The record companies still want them on their major labels, and they want them out on tours selling, to 20,000 seater venues. That's what they want. It hasn't gone away, right? And here we have Rush in 1980 proving that point. I've also put on Duke by Genesis, which is Genesis drawing that in, but Duke is an out prog album. It's not a prog album like Foxtrot. It is different. It's more concise, but all the elements that make prog what they are, except perhaps long form compositions, right? Except that one, they've pulled everything in to something that's a little bit more concise, but everything else is there. I've also put the Peter Gabriel album with Gabe's Out Frontiers, that one there, all from 1980. We're going in, the progness is still there by the prog artists. In 1981, King Crimson reform, and they bring out an album called Discipline. And I think this really, King Crimson being the band that really states what progressive rock is in 1969, and then in 1972-73 with the Locks, Tongues and Aspic band redirect what prog could be and show that the fact that this old way of doing this is over. I think that's what King Crimson do with that band. They don't really solve it, but I think Robert Fripp is aware in 73 that this progressive rock way of doing things is about to change. We see it change. It emerges in a much more concise fashion where these progressive rock techniques are still there, but they've been pulled in. What King Crimson do with the album Discipline is, this is an album that is influenced by the new wave. This is an album where we can point at and we can hear not only the influences of the new wave, bands like Talking Heads, but also the influences of Steve Reich, and the minimalist composers. And so what we have here is rock musicians and doing what they did in the 70s, which is take classical music forms and integrate them in rock music. With King Crimson at this point, it's minimalism. It's the new influence. Of course, as I say this, I realise that Mike Oldfield had already done this on Tubular Bells and sold 10 million albums or whatever. But Discipline for me, as a prog fan, was the blueprint of how you make prog in the 1980s. All right, with these special, I think this is where I could see a way of expressing myself as a musician, because of course we're at the point now in 1981, whereas I'm there. I'm experiencing this firsthand. I am buying albums. I am now a music fan. I'm 13 years old. I'm a big prog fan, and I'm buying Yes and Genesis, and I go out and get this King Crimson album, and I thought, oh, this is interesting, and this is a way of me doing prog which would be relevant to my friends who are into, all the indie and new wave bands that they're into. So this is really, really important. Right, so 1982, I've got 3 albums to pick from, and I haven't decided which one I'm going to pick yet. I've got the debut album by Aisha, which for me is all the prog ideas with the prog supergroup and Carl Palmer, was it Jeff Downs, John Wetton and Steve Howe, forming a band which is really just an out-and-out pop band, and then having hit records and selling millions of albums. I think this album sold something like 4 million albums. Is Aisha's first album a prog album? I don't think it is, but you'll see Aisha covered in the prog, media because of the people involved, but I don't think it is. But I think the pop album, The Dreaming by Kate Bush, that came out that same year, is an out-and-out prog album, as is Number of the Beast by Iron Maiden. So which one am I going to pick? I think I'm going to go, now I'm here doing this, I'm going to go with Number of the Beast by Iron Maiden, because I think we have to make the case that heavy metal carries the torch of prog forward, right? And we're going to see this on this list. Every now and then I'm going to be picking up, a sort of prog metal album or a math rock album. They're going to keep popping up throughout this as we see heavy metal carries on all the way through, pulling these progressive rock influences together. So that's what I've got for 1982 is Number of the Beast by Iron Maiden. I didn't expect to do that, but I'm going to do that. Right, 1983. is the year of neo-prog. Alright, so what the hell's neo-prog? Now this is where it becomes personal, because I played drums for the neo-prog band IQ. And as this list goes forward, my personal vision of being on the outside of prog as a fan and moving to the inside of prog and seeing it as being a member of these bands is going to start to have an effect. But of course, I was only, in 1983, I was only 15 years old. I was reading Kerrang, which was the British magazine that covered heavy metal, and they were covering at the same time a whole bunch of these neo-prog bands, which would have been Marillion, IQ, Palace, Pendragon and 12th Night. I think I've covered them all there. And suddenly there's all these bands there, and these bands haven't got deals, but they're making waves on this circuit that has emerged in the aftermath of punk. Neo-prog bands are birthed in the aftermath of punk, and it goes a little bit like this. Punk comes along and it democratises rock music, so anyone can play it and anybody can do what they want to do. And there's a whole bunch of guys out there, completely unfashionable, that aren't into the music everyone else is into. They're into old Genesis albums, and they form bands that sound like Genesis but have the sort of drive and sort of aggression of punk a little bit, and maybe the sort of emotional characteristics that have come out of pop music at that time, you know, more songs about relationships perhaps than had happened before. And these bands emerge and they suddenly start to kick up a stink. In 1983, Marillion, which was one of the first of these neo-prog bands to get a major record deal, released Script for a Jester's Tear, right? Also that year we get Tales from the Lush Attic by IQ, but at that point IQ haven't got a major deal. They basically released that album themselves. I would say if you want to hear an incredible 1983 neo-prog album, go and listen to Tales of the Lush Attic. I remember checking out Script for a Jester's Tear in 1983 and thought, oh yeah, this sounds like a bit like a Genesis ripoff. It didn't impress me particularly at the time, but this was extremely popular. Marillion go on to become one of the biggest bands in the 1980s with top 40 pop records. We're going to get to that in a minute. Right, it's worth noting that the year before, 12th Night had released Fact or Fiction, beating Marillion to the post a little bit, and the following year we got Palace bring out The Sentinel, and I really like Palace. They seem to be closer to the new wave of British heavy metal bands a little bit, but they're still out and out prog. But 1983 is the year of neo-prog, and neo-prog, like it or not, was full on prog. It's not prog in disguise like Genesis albums or Yes albums of this time or Rush albums. This is out and out prog, and these are bands almost in a sort of looking back self-referential approach are really keeping the hardcore prog torch alive throughout the 80s. This is going to be really important as we get later on, because as we know, there are literally tens of thousands of prog bands out there now. There's tens of thousands of prog releases coming out, thousands of them, with all these bands that are not prog bands in the sense that they are progressing rock music. They are totally revisionist and looking back, and that really has its birth here with the neo-prog bands, right? Represented by, for me, 1983, Script for a Jester's Tear by Marillion. 1984, however, sees the release of The Seaside by the Cardiacs. By Cardiacs. Cardiacs are a post-punk band. Oh, what? Look, I'm going to tell you something straight now. I'm not hugely knowledgeable about Cardiacs. I believe that they could well be the greatest progressive rock band of all time. I believe they could well be the greatest post-punk band of all time. They could well be the greatest avant-garde rock band of all time. The Seaside may well be the greatest. Well, I'm looking at this. This could well be the greatest album of this list of 1980s and one of the greatest progressive rock albums ever made. I cannot tell you the regard in which I held the band Cardiacs. They are a product of almost everything at that point that's happened in rock music history, but everything amped up to the extreme. And so for the general listener, this is a difficult listen. For me, a lot of avant-garde rock albums, you know, like Captain Beefheart, and you can tell there's a ton of Captain Beefheart in the Cardiacs, right? They don't have the accessibility that the Cardiacs do, because when I hear the Cardiacs, as much as there's some really abstract bits and strange bits and incredibly musically complex bits and some incredible almost like modern classical moments that are like Frank Zappa, you know, all that's there, but they also have an accessible pop hook aspect to them, which suddenly will emerge on the chorus and then be taken away. You know, Cardiacs are somewhere between Captain Beefheart, Frank Zappa and Madness. That's the only way I can describe them. So many great albums. This one in 1984 is one of the first proper albums by the classic lineup of Cardiacs. It's an absolute masterpiece. I listened to it in preparation for this video last night. I put it on, and I often, when I have to check out one of these albums, I'm listening to it to just get ideas of what I'm going to say, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's interesting. With this album, I was just totally drawn in, and I was just taken on this journey, and they kept hitting me all the time. And some of the songs on here are just out and out prog, complex, monumental masterpieces. Some of it sounds like indie rock, some of it is just weird. I can't say. This is what progressive rock begat. The Cardiacs. This is what we have in the 1980s. There'll be many people here that will not want to class them as a prog band, which is ridiculous. They're about the most prog band in history. Right, and here they are in the 1980s with this album, The Seaside. I've talked about this aesthetic. This aesthetic of... The English aesthetic is in Cardiacs, but the English seaside aesthetic, you know, the naughty postcard, the sort of carry-on, shabby, English at play aesthetic is all over the Cardiacs. It's a whimsical lament to past glories. That's what the English seaside aesthetic is for me. And this album's got it in buckets. Right? The Cardiacs have that. What is my point here? 1984. What is my point here? Is an absolutely monumental, not sold loads, but it's a monumental progressive rock album that is absolute genius, that is out and out progressive rock, that takes in everything that's happened musically to that point and concisely delivers a piece of high art through the techniques and approaches that were pioneered by the genre of progressive rock. Is it a difficult listen? Yes, it is. But it's still a work of art. In 1984, when apparently prog had gone and was wiped out by punk. Right, so that's why I've got that at 1984. 1985, I've got a choice of two albums, and I know which one I'm going to put on. It's the other end of what progressive rock is supplying in the 1980s. So, it could be Misplaced Childhood by Marillion, which spawns the huge hit record Kayleigh, or it could be Hounds of Love by Kate Bush, which spawns about 3 worldwide massive hits. Both of these albums are progressive rock albums. If you don't believe me about Hounds of Love, it actually contains a whole sidelong epic, which is about someone cast adrift in the sea and considering their life, and they visit their family as a ghost, and they wake a witch that is asleep under the water. It's about the most prog thing you could ever imagine. Is it Genesis? No. It's prog shot through an aesthetic that's coming from 80s sampling, and I've talked about this on a video about Kate Bush if you want to go and check it out. I think I'm going to go with Hounds of Love, because with 1984 I have The Seaside by the Cardiacs, and that shows the fact that in mid-1980s prog is alive and kicking and making still esoteric heavy art. And by the same token, the ideas of prog have now released, have reached the masses, and with Hounds of Love we have an out and out prog album which is leading the way. Prog did not go away. It did not diminish in the 80s. It's there. It's just it's moved out into the world. the children of prog are out there having these incredible successes. So I think I'm going to put Hounds of Love by Kate Bush. 1986, we can see this is a theme now. You know, we can see I'm pulling pop albums, and the album I could go for is The Colour of Spring by Talk Talk. You know, is this art pop? Is it prog? Don't know. It's hugely influenced by prog. It'd be interesting to put Talk Talk through the progometer that I have used on previous videos. That would be interesting. The other album I'd like to put in 1986 would be Album by Public Image Limited, and I think this is the one I'm going to go for, because what we have here is the sort of the drawing of the circle from punk, you know, which I really believe that there's more prog in the Sex Pistols than there is the Sex Pistols in post-punk prog. I think the influence goes the other way. And we've talked about, you know, John Lydon's love of Van de Graaff Generator and the influence of his vocal sound, the influence of Ian Anderson on his image, you know, and that being part of that, the use of the English aesthetic, and all those things that are in punk bands. But by the time he forms Public Image Limited, I really believe that Lydon is a virtuoso musician. He's a virtuoso musician on his own terms, and he is advancing that band. When he hooks up with the producer Bill Laswell, and he teams him up with a band that consists of Tony Williams and Ginger Baker on drums, Jonas Helberg on bass, you know, Zakir Hussain on tabla, El Shankar on electric violin. Basically Shakti's on this album, John McGothlin Shakti. When you team him up with Steve Vai on electric guitar, and they make this a conceptually unified prog album with the epic final track Ease, which goes on for like it's extended by that incredible guitar solo by Steve Vai. It ticks the boxes so much of what progressive rock is, and it for me it draws the circle of how punk fits into this story, and how we end up with this pop punk album here in 1986, which spawns hit singles. So that's the album I've got for 1986 to cover that. Right, 1987. Okay, I think the 80s, especially here in the UK, is a very interesting time for pop music, and I think the reason why the pop music is so interesting, as we've seen, is because it's infused by a huge influence from progressive rock, and I've tried to discuss that here. As the 80s continued, however, you see that the pop music starts to become, how can I describe this? It loses its edge, it loses its sort of teenage angst aspect. The pop music seems to become part of the mainstream, it becomes establishment. I think this happens with Live Aid in 1985. I think Live Aid turned all these pop and rock musicians from being sort of, you know, young, you know, cutting edge musicians that are pushing against the system. They sort of become part of the system, and we're all supposed to applaud them and go, oh, aren't they wonderful characters for trying to, you know, cure, you know, world poverty. And look at the drummer from Genesis, you know, jettisoning on Concord from one side of the world to the other to play with Led Zeppelin, and they'll get, and the whole thing changes the dynamic of pop music. I think that Live Aid is a watershed in the history of rock and pop music, which is far greater than punk, and it invents the legend, it invents the establishment rock. You know, it's Mark Knopfler with his headband in Dire Straits, you know, doing Money for Nothing and all that type of thing. It's yuppie rock, it's establishment rock, it's dad rock, it's where Marillion are gonna go. You know, it's music for dads to listen to while they're dropping their kids off for work. Rock music has changed. The next generation's there, and the older generation are flying their untrendy flags for rock music. And if you search for prog albums in 1987, there's only one that comes up, and it was a huge album, and it's Momentary Lapse of Reason by Pink Floyd, the ultimate dad rock album. You know, so we could see that prog has got its influences in other genres and is having its effect, but prog here, I think this is the moment where we could say that mainstream prog starts to lose its way. That those bands like Genesis and Yes and Pink Floyd, they actually do a good job in the early 80s. Not so much Pink Floyd, but The Wall without a doubt. But here, they've just got too old and too stayed in their ways, without a doubt. And Momentary Lapse of Reason is an example of that. Me working in the prog world, when I was playing in it, I played in so many prog festivals where I could see some totally boring band on stage seesawing their way through two chords while someone did a sort of Dave Gilmour-esque guitar solo. And I would ask, I'd turn around and say, is this prog? What is this? And what it was is a sort of sad weekend warrior dad rock version of what people think is prog, which has been influenced by albums like Momentary Lapse of Reason. And I don't want to put it on the list, but it's the only one that comes up. It's the great big prog album in 1987. I did I did search around, and I did discover that also Surfing with the Alien by Joe Satriani actually came out in 1987. Now this is really important because in the mid-80s we suddenly have this guitar explosion with Steve Vai, Joe Satriani, and Racer X, and every metal band starts to take on a virtuoso guitarist. Megadeth has Marty Friedman, and we get all that type of stuff, and we're now moving towards what we could describe as prog metal, right? And I think that has its roots with Joe Satriani and Steve Vai. And Satriani is one of the first ones to have a really big selling album, so I'm going to put that one in for 1987, Surfing with the Alien. The real flag of prog, cutting edge prog, is perhaps going to now be held high by these prog metal bands, and I've got at 1988 Operation Mindcrime, by Queensryche, a great progressive metal album. This couldn't happen until thrash metal happened. You've got new wave of British heavy metal, then you've got the thrash metal, like the Metallicas, the Slayers, the Anthraxes, and then because that progressive rock bit of DNA is in metal, we then get prog metal emerging. Now, I criticise prog metal. I love all this stuff here because the computers haven't got any involved. These are real bands playing, real prog metal. And also, these albums are conceptual. They really are prog albums. I think Operation Mindcrime is the one I'm going to put forward. But you also had No Exit by Fate's Warnings. We got Dimension Hatros by Voivod. These are killer. So 1988 is the watershed killer year for prog metal, and that's what I'm going to put in 1988. In 1989 we see the first Dream Theater album, and love them or hate them, Dream Theater, a little bit like Marillion and the whole neo-proggers in the 1980s, Dream Theater is really going to hold the flag up throughout the 90s, which I'm now going to talk about on the next video. About what prog is and where it's come from. Dream Theater, without them, perhaps prog would have slowly just gone into the ether. But here we have this another huge band, and it's the metalers that keep it going. Prog metal, going right back to Rush, which is why I put 2112 on the list in 1976. And you can see how these things. So what do we have in the 1980s? What we have is prog actually existing in a whole bunch of places. The influence of prog in pop music. The influence of prog in avant-garde rock music, which I think we can see with Cardiacs and also with Discipline by King Crimson. We can see the emergence of prog ideas in the sort of guitar virtuosity of those shred guitarists that came out in the 80s that then feed into thrash metal, which has got prog in it, and we get prog metal emerging in the late 80s. The late 80s, there's going to be a huge change in music. This is brought on by the advent of hip-hop. Hip-hop gets serious with, NWA and Public Image Limited. Dance music emerges, and dance music begats forms like house music and techno, and then, jungle and drum and bass, and eventually trip-hop. And we get metal go from sort of the hair metal bands like Poison and Guns N' Roses. We get Soundgarden and Pearl Jam and Nirvana. For me, there's a shift in popular music that happens in the late 80s, which is as great as, if not greater, than the shift that happened in the 70s with punk rock. And it sort of changes everything and it opens everything up. And and I think we'll start to see the progressive tendency, which I describe as the tendency to want to take a form and push it forward. All these new visceral forms that have now emerged, hip-hop, funk metal, grunge, dance music, jungle, all these forms which have start off visceral, right? They're like rock and roll. They're going to advance very quickly, and they're going to advance using the techniques of progressive rock. And we're going to be discussing that when we look at the 90s next. But we will leave it there for now. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and put a comment in. If you want to see the next video and see some more, press subscribe and press the notification bell. And if you want to support me in doing what I'm doing here, then there's a Patreon link, and there's a whole ton of stuff there which is supporting me making these videos as well on the history of progressive rock in 60 albums. So how many albums have we covered now? We've done the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 60s, 70s and 80s. So I'm halfway. I've gone through 30 albums now. We've got another 30 to go, and I'm going to be going into an area I seldom talk about on this channel, which is progressive rock from 1990 onwards. This is going to be a scary thing, you know. And I will be getting into why it's scary. Part of it is because, you know, by the mid-2000s I've become a part of the progressive rock world, albeit in a very small way, but I do become part of it. And you'll see my viewpoint moving from the outside to the inside. Anyway, I hope you like this video, and I will see you on the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye.